several weeks ago. March 21st, we met as a group, and we had an exchange of information about various government programs that are engaged in adaptation and resilience, particularly with focus on how to collaborate across agencies. And we, leading up to that, put out a survey where people, both in the survey and during the session, highlighted ways that we can align our efforts, particularly with a focus on reducing barriers for people applying to programs, participating in them. And that involves us amongst one another, understanding each other's work and the opportunities available, and then being able to socialize with our constituencies the opportunities that exist, as well as understanding one another's technical assistance, because this is where the capacity to support various applicants to programs gets more complex. And to be able to understand how EPA is approaching technical assistance and how that complements or differs from how the Office of Coastal Management, for example, is providing technical assistance both to the applicant and the funded program. Those are very important areas where we can collaborate over time and lean on one another's expertise. Particularly, folks identified risk assessment and financial assistance as some of the kinds of technical assistance that federal programs can and should, when possible, provide to applicants so that their barriers to entry are lowered, and so that there's common approaches to risk assessment and a common set of information about how to get financial assistance. And that leads to this larger idea of a common vocabulary. We're all using terms in similar ways, but they mean different things in different communities of practice. So not so much to make everyone all speak the same way, but we have to be able to understand one another when we're talking about things. So, for instance, what one program means by equity might be different from what another one does. Just for example, whether it's environmental justice versus making sure there's distributional equity in how grants go out versus dealing with intergenerational systemic equity issues. Those are different aspects of equity. So in the resilience and adaptation space, the way we use these terms, the way we support communities of practice through them, through using and applying those terms really matters. We would do well to collaborate on an evaluation, focusing on, say, climate literacy and the literacy of using climate information for equitable adaptation. We would do well to evaluate the actions people are taking to build resilience. So these are some of the major themes that came out of the work. We'd also learned that our programs as a federal family are covering pretty much every level of governments and mostly focused on the USA. Not surprisingly, we're talking about IRA and BIL, which are domestically focused programs. And that's where our focus as a group is right now. But we all have different, sorry about the problem with this slide, but we all have different kinds of capacity and capabilities that we're addressing. Slides with this information have been shared from Ruben in the past, so I'm not going to go through this in detail. And we're addressing different sectors. David's going to be speaking about different communities of practice today. And so the way we self-organize across communities of practice in these sectors is a very fast path for us, having shared language, being able to develop a common approach to evaluation and so forth. On the toolkit team, I work on the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. We have been very intently focused on providing the kinds of information that we collected in that survey and that meeting through our website. And so if you go there today, you'll see the Federal Adaptation and Resilience Program inventory, which is categorized by those sectors. You can find the different programs previewed with the intention of helping people get where they're going fast and make those linkages as constituents out of federal services. And with that, I think that's a useful springboard for you, David, to further elaborate your goals for today.
Thank you, Ned. Thank you, Ruben. And thanks everyone for being here. I see we have quite a large number now, 70, maybe 70 plus. And so I think this is going to be a good discussion. Some of you may recall, some of you may not have been involved, but over a year ago now, maybe 2 years ago, as a subgroup of both the FARG and the downscaling projections group, Fred Lipschultz and Mike Cooperberg and I started a subgroup that we called generally the Climate Information Systems subgroup, which was an offshoot of the FARG, but inclusive beyond the FARG is what I mean to say. And we together as a subgroup, to kind of move out on different tasks together, we identified two key questions and two key challenges. One being, how can we democratize access to the latest generation of downscaled climate projections that are being featured, for example, in the 5th National Climate Assessment? And so we've been working together across the federal family on the initiative known as the Climate Resilience Information System and some offshoots of that to address that problem set. And we'll be giving a detailed update on that in the next FARG quarterly. Progress is being made on that front. The second question we identified is how could we address together recognizing that there's an overall proliferation of tools and resources and portals and so forth. And this is something that got flagged in the climate services workshop hosted by Julian Reyes and others recently, that there's just been a proliferation of tools. And so the second question that we had pivoted to, and we're coming back full circle to readdress here today, is how can we together work collaboratively to offer a more cohesive and coherent presentation of collectively our online resources that are designed to help with adaptation and resilience. So just to kind of summarize the problems here, you guys don't need me to explain this problem to you, that, the places where we live, the places that we work, and the built environments, the infrastructure that we manage and that our society hinges on are growing. We have more assets in harm's way. And we also see that there's been a rapid growth in the number and the frequency and the severity of extreme events that have caused problems that are impacting people, human health, and natural resources, as well as built environment. And this is, of course, showing up also in the form of risk and financial risk facing our communities. And so the question that we all confront is, how are we able to meet the climate crisis at scale? And so one of the things we want to talk about here today is, are there things that we can do where we're stronger together? And so if we go to the next slide, one of the things that we heard, NASA and NOAA co-funded a report by the 18F task force, and we're going to share that report. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may not have, in a follow-up after this meeting, and other resources that serve as references. But one of the things that we heard and that they heard, the 18F task force, is if they're talking to municipal government leaders, local, state, tribal government leaders, talking to adaptation practitioners, people who are in the bullseye of our target audiences, what they were saying is sometimes they can't find what they're looking for. Other times they're finding it, but in duplicate, quadruplicate out there, and they're not sure which they should focus on. In some cases, there may seem to be conflicting answers, although different entities may have used different methodologies to produce outputs. So they're not necessarily in conflict, but they can cause confusion. In other cases, they're saying I have to go here for these utilities, but then here for these utilities and here for these utilities. And why aren't they conjoined? And what they were also saying is we want to be able to quickly and efficiently identify what's available. We want to integrate it into our own deliberations, our deliberative processes here, where we're able to commingle interoperably federal data, decision relevant data, together with local, state, or tribal data, both environmental, socioeconomic, social vulnerabilities, those types of data as well, for knowledge building and so that we can confront our exposures and our risk. And then we need to be able to communicate with our elected officials. So on the right, we not only want to assimilate and synthesize that knowledge, but we want to fold it into our communication objectives, either communicating with executive leadership or elected leadership, communicating with grant funding agencies or entities like FEMA or HUD or transportation. We want to be able to also communicate with our citizens, our Chamber of Commerce, our constituencies, if there are decisions, if we need to issue municipal bonds, if we're going to make policy changes and so forth. So I'll invite everyone who's not speaking to go ahead and mute. So, and then later we will have an opportunity for people to speak during plenary. But I'm just going to go ahead now and ask everyone to please mute who's not speaking. Thank you. So the next slide, in addition, is just sort of a recognition that this is more than a technical challenge. I attended a workshop whereby a group of us were working on making available data and tools for educators in the classroom. And we were hearing from educators that, gosh, you should have listened to us first. And we were coming to realize that quite often the challenges in sharing domains of expertise and sharing data and working with our constituencies is not a technical challenge. They can be much more readily solvable. And so this is sort of an IT manager's proverb that one of the people shared with us in that workshop, which is, may all your problems be technical in nature. And the point being, these are often problems of human relationship. So there's an elephant in the room here that part of what we want to do is kind of get that out on the table. So if you go to the next slide, as we know, part of the reason why there is such a proliferation of tools and resources across the federal family and with our grantees and partners is just in general the culture we work in. There are cultural, systemic, and financial incentives to work in silos. In some cases, we don't necessarily mean to be competitive. In other cases, we perhaps do. Either way, there's kind of a competition to be able to essentially pursue or preserve our respective agency, our respective programs' budget dollars. And so we want to have our storefronts, we want to have our information, our tools, we want to be and to be seen as serving our constituencies. So we want to brand and position our agencies. We want credit and recognition for the authority that we bring and the mission mandate we're fulfilling. And then, of course, there are limited bandwidth, limited resources. So there's any number of drivers. But ultimately, the question is, can there be some shared strategies, some overarching strategies that would allow us to balance this equation, whereby we can do those things, promote our agencies, serve our constituencies, brand and position ourselves to be pursuing our mission mandates, while at the same time overcoming some of the challenges that I flashed up earlier with respect to overwhelming some of our constituencies or some of our user groups and better harmonizing our efforts? Might there be unifying focal points? So the next slide is just talking about, is sort of an illustration of this point. If, say, there was an effort to stand up a tool whereby we're sharing data or capabilities or a service, if we had, say, 3 hypothetical agencies, each who had 100K to invest, they may be inventing or reinventing a lot of that same foundational capability with some of those funds. And they may be standing up 3 storefronts where there's some competition for audience bandwidth and there's some challenge there. Next slide. If we could take those same resources and co-invest it or synergize it or work more collaboratively together, we might raise all boats farther and faster for that same amount of money. We might harmonize or make sure that our strengths and our utilities and capabilities are more seamlessly presented and offered to our audiences in a way that helps realize efficiencies from the audience standpoint. But it also might allow us all to invest our dollars as we go forward on those things that are our core strengths. So we don't have to keep building foundational capabilities over and over again. We can sort of build on top as we make investments that gradually and over time lift all boats. And that's really what this conversation's about is, are there things where we're stronger together and ways that we can lift all boats? So the challenge then, again, to restate, and what we're going to talk about here today is how may we offer a more cohesive and coherent presentation of federal agencies' online resources for adaptation and resilience? And is it possible to do that while also allowing agencies or programs to market and position themselves? Can we have our cake and eat it too here? So there are several possible pathways whereby we can do that. We're going to lay out 3 here for your consideration. Others can come up as well through the course of the breakout discussions. But in particular, these were 3 that we, the FARG co-chairs and others helping in sort of formulating this workshop, we developed together. One would be, as Ned just mentioned in his run-up to this, the outtake from the previous workshop, is to recognize that there are already existing communities of practice. And some good examples might be, for example, the Climate Change and Human Health Group. There is a nature-based solutions community of practice that arose out of the FARG and has already been working very actively in this space for nature-based solutions, in particular in the context of responding to the National Nature Assessment, for example. I'm aware also and learned recently of this new DoD-led Climate Community of Interest working group and platform that Sonny Westcott and Rebecca Solon and Sarah Larkin are leading. So they're formulating a platform and an opportunity for groups to work together and sort of sharing knowledge. And so this could be a place that these working groups, these communities of practice could come together to share reference documents, to deliberate together, share lessons learned and so forth, and to help facilitate co-production. And I see Sonny, thank you. She's just dropped some information. I'm sorry, DHS, my apologies, Department of Homeland Security. I misspoke. Thank you for correcting me there, Sonny. So it could be a way to leverage and utilize the capability that y'all are standing up to help some of these communities of practice consider how might we co-develop training together to make sure we have a climate-ready workforce. How might we co-develop technical assistance together and evolve together as we're serving communities? Might there be a professional development that we co-develop together where we begin to blend and harmonize our strengths? And that sort of points to the next slide. Frank Niepold and Haley Krim and the Keck working group have been doing an inventory of professional development. It turns out, I think there is something on the order of 24 different federal offices or entities that are working on climate-related training. And so the thinking here is that we could begin to coalesce this in a way that has structure and purpose that's shared across the federal family. And it might look something like this. This is just a concept. But at the core or at the hub, there could be the cluster or the set of climate 101 trainings and related, like what are the basics of climate change, the basics of sea level rise, adaptation and mitigation and the terminology, the steps to resilience framework, the different frameworks and so forth. So that could live at the hub. And then a next slide, there could be spokes that are sort of emanating or radiating out from that hub that move increasingly deeper into specific applied areas, such as are discussed and described in the chapters of the 5th National Climate Assessment, climate and agriculture, climate and water systems, and so forth. So, for example, the EPA has a Creating Resilient Water Utilities program, and it supports and works very actively with water utility managers. And they've garnered support also from NOAA and other agency-funded programs in academia to begin to build that community of practice and to begin to co-develop the tools and resources in a structured way to serve those people who are in water utility management. And so this has been a successful effort. It's still evolving, and it's been developing under the name Water Utility Climate Alliance. But that would just be one example. The CHIG maybe as another example, the Climate Change and Human Health Group, where there could be a structured, purposeful progression of learnings that we would co-develop together. So if you go to the next slide, we're envisioning there could be recurring, interactive, sort of cursors on, expert-led trainings, virtually delivered, over a platform such as Zoom. And so if we have, say, this stormwater tool or what have you, the leaders, the developers of that tool could be on hand to teach people how they're used, could answer questions about particular use cases. They could be recorded for asynchronous viewing. And if they recurred several times a year, we're thinking that's not a heavy burden on the tool developer because it would be recurring. It's right there in their wheelhouse. It's giving them an opportunity to promote awareness and use of their tool. And yet these things could live online and be available for asynchronous viewing. So it's allowing us to build a more coherent and purposeful structure. One of the things that I've noticed, and part of the idea for this sort of came about when in some of our earliest listening sessions on the toolkit, when we were hearing from constituents who said, look, we know you're not going to be able to pre-calculate all the answers to all the questions that we have. At some point, we're going to want and need to talk to subject matter experts. And so we had begun thinking, how can we balance the equation without overwhelming our subject experts? Might there be something like this, where there's a modest time commitment, but it sort of recurs? So if I see, Ned's going to come back and give a demonstration of this tool on May 27th, I can watch his presentation, I can register, and I can come ready to engage to ask Ned questions specific to my location or my asset type. So the hope is that we could do this in a way that gets us out of the more sort of ad hoc mode. I'm getting emails in my inbox every day inviting me to webinars and trainings. But if there was a meta structure that we could conceive and develop together, this might be more efficient over time. So that would be one pathway. The second pathway would then be to co-produce an inventory of recommended tools and resources in a shareable database. And so this could be tagged according to commonly used terms. Ned mentioned this common vocabulary, but our assets, our information, resources, and tools and online information could be tagged according to our target audience's motivations, such as they're concerned about asset types, they're concerned about hazard types, they're at this step in a resilience building process, geography, et cetera, et cetera. And so this could be shareable so that next slide, everyone could have and be able to integrate this same information. So one of the things that we've heard is that it's great, there's the climate resilience toolkit, but to some extent, a disadvantage of a resource like the toolkit is, well, we in this agency, we in this department aren't as readily able to brand and position ourselves. We want our own storefront, as it were. And so the point then is if we co-develop this together, then all agencies could have and host this information. It wouldn't only live in the toolkit. We would certainly make it available and discoverable through the toolkit, but other agencies could also stand up their own index pages, whereby they can integrate it into their own sort of one-stop or their own service offering. So this would be a way to balance that equation of, well, I can attract users to come to my site, my storefront, but end users aren't punished because they knocked on the wrong door. They're not at some sort of a disadvantage that they happen to knock on this door and not that door. That ultimately working in the direction of a no wrong door approach. And this was a strategy that was explicitly called for by the 18F task force based on what they heard from end user communities. The next slide is, of course, making the point that, again, we're not starting from scratch. There's work in this space already ongoing. For example, the KEC team has already begun doing an inventory of trainings. And this is just a screenshot from an interactive Airtable they have. It could be output in, say, an XML or a .csv format or other formats that would be shareable across the federal family. So everyone could have and host this. So we're sort of seeing this effort evolve into how do we begin to build that connective tissue between our respective programs. And then that brings me to the third pathway that we just wanted to highlight today as a possibility, which would be we could co-develop, fine-tune, and implement a commonly used web search utility. And it might be conjoined with, say, an AI and a semantic web utility that could also be hosted on any federal website, which would allow, therefore, users to be able to do search cross-domain searches. Again, enhancing that no wrong door aspect of it doesn't matter which of the websites they go to. And it could sort of look and behave something like this. If you go to the next slide, we could leverage, adopt, and adapt an AI or a semantic web tool that would be able to crawl the federal landscape. All of the agencies under auspices of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, for example, and other identified designees or grantees that are working in partnership with us, index their information. And then all of that information, what is both public facing and the meta tagging, as well as other databases like curated databases, such as the previous one, the Airtable I showed, could all be indexed and then stored at this location. So if you go to the next slide, it would be made discoverable. So if a user goes to EPA or FEMA or the toolkit or USGCRP or any agency, it could be discoverable if they're not finding immediately what they're looking for and they want to cast a wider net. Then that information could be discoverable to them. They would find it in that database. And then the next slide. So it's essentially allowing, again, agencies to attract audiences to brand and position themselves. But again, the audience has the benefit of being able to find the superset of information that we identify as ready and appropriate for use in planning and decision making. So building on this same technology, I want to also make the case that each of these pathways has benefits. I think no regrets benefits in its own right if we pursue any one individually, but they also are synergistic. And if we could pursue them all together, they may further enhance the benefits of the others. So the next slide is just showing a concept. This is kind of a very primitive wireframe that same semantic tool that I was describing could either auto-generate or facilitate hand-curated generation of index pages or landing pages. These could be hazard-focused pages. They could be asset-focused. They could be data type or tool type focused. They could be harmonized on any of a number of axes that we might like. So if you go to the next slide, there are tools that exist, and we could certainly talk about how they work, and we could show examples of how they work in action. But they could auto-populate fields, and so it essentially allow you to have templates for very rapid stand-up of dynamically generated and/or hand-curated landing pages. So the next slide, would be an example. It would be on any given agency's site. It could have a thematic focus. I'm just arbitrarily going to say, suppose it was sea level change, coastal erosion, and infrastructure. And we might have training and tutorial videos in that diagram that I showed where there could be trainings. The search engine could unpack what is called bulky content videos. If we had a 20 or 25-minute training video, it would be able to transcribe those videos and make the contents of what's being discussed also discoverable. So people can unpack bulky content like such as what is in videos or in PDF documents and make it findable in these index pages. So it's a way to start to unlock and harmonize our information. So we could say a lot more, but I just wanted to lay out these three possible pathways and make the case that individually they could pay dividends for all of us here. We may be stronger together if all of us co-develop these and implement them together individually, but then all together we may also be able to realize the further benefits such as I've described. So that brings me to the conclusion of the summary of the three pathways we wanted to highlight for you. So we wanted to take, say, 30 minutes or so and invite you all to join small group breakouts for a think, pair, share conversation. In these small groups, and in a minute, Ruben's going to come back on and just give us more specific instructions, but just at a high level, the point would then be for you all to take a little bit of time. I realize that we've just sort of fire hosed you with a lot of information, but to begin to process and unpack, what did you hear of these pathways? Do you have value for these pathways, for any of them or all of them? Do you have any concerns or red flags? And so please identify someone in your group who can capture notes, whatever are the key highlights or takeaways, and someone to also serve as a facilitator to make sure everyone has an opportunity to share their views and ideas or concerns. And then jot down any essential points that we might need to hear back in plenary. Like if you think this won't work, if you think there's a significant problem or challenge, then we probably need to hear about that when we come back in plenary. So any essential ideas that need to be shared and discussed in plenary when we come back. And then, of course, we recognize some new ideas. You might say, well, you didn't identify pathway 4 and 5, and these are things we could also do. Definitely make a note of those. We'll parking lot them, and we can come back to them later. So we do want to hear about it, but we may not dive deep into that here. So then later on, when we come back into plenary, you'll share whoever is the rapporteur, the designated spokesperson, if there are key things we need to hear. We're not asking for report outs from everybody, but just if there are key things that people feel it's essential get said for all to hear when we come back to plenary. So with that, Ruben, how do you want to direct us as we move off into these small group